In June of 1314, on the rolling fields near Stirling, two armies prepared to decide a nation's fate. On one side stood Robert the Bruce, a warrior king hardened by years of relentless guerrilla war, his followers driven by the dream of independence. On the other side, Edward II of England commanded one of Europe's mightiest hosts, tens of thousands of armoured knights, archers and infantry marching under banners of royal power. Outnumbered nearly 3-1, the Scots faced more than a battle. They faced extinction or freedom. What followed over the next 2 days was a clash so brutal and so unlikely in its outcome that it shattered English dominance and carved Scotland's defiance into legend. 7 centuries later, the echoes of Bannockburn still ring as the moment a small nation stood tall against an empire. But to see how Scotland reached Bannockburn, we must return to the chaos decades before. The story of Bannockburn begins not on the battlefield, but in the sudden collapse of a kingdom. In 1286, King Alexander III of Scotland fell from his horse and died, leaving his realm without a strong monarch. His heir was a child, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Before she could take the crown, she too died in 1290. Scotland was left adrift, leaderless and vulnerable. Into this vacuum stepped Edward III of England, a king whose ambition earned him the name Hammer of the Scots. Asked to arbitrate the succession, he instead tightened his grip. John Balliol was placed on the throne, but soon reduced to a puppet. Scotland, once proud, now bent under English dominance. The humiliation bred resentment, and resentment turned to open defiance. That defiance found its first great champion in William Wallace. In 1297, Wallace and Andrew Moray led a rebellion that stunned England, defeating its forces at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. For a moment it seemed that freedom might be within reach, but the dream faltered. At Falkirk the next year, Edward crushed the Scots, and in 1305 Wallace was captured and executed in London. His brutal death, hanged, drawn and quartered, was meant to extinguish hope. Instead, it transformed him into a martyr. Wallace's sacrifice lit a fire that would not be put out. Among those who carried it forward was Robert Bruce, grandson of one of the original claimants to the throne. At this time, Bruce was not yet a hero, nor even a secure leader. But the winds of rebellion were shifting, and soon he would seize a chance to turn Scotland's despair into a renewed fight for sovereignty. From Wallace's martyrdom, a new figure emerged, one destined to carry Scotland's hopes into battle. Robert Bruce's path to kingship was as bloody as it was uncertain. Born into a noble family with a claim to the throne, he watched Scotland's struggle unfold in turmoil. By 1306, driven by ambition and conviction, Bruce took a decisive and dangerous step. He confronted his rival, John Comyn, inside a church. The quarrel ended with Comyn's death at Bruce's hands, an act that shocked Christendom and earned him excommunication. Yet that same year, Bruce was crowned King of Scots. His reign, however, began in desperation. Hunted by English forces, condemned by the church, and abandoned by many nobles, Bruce seemed doomed. He lost battles, fled into hiding, and lived on the margins of survival, but exile forged resilience. Instead of surrendering, he embraced new tactics. No longer would the Scots face England in open fields where armoured knights could dominate. Instead, Bruce waged war in shadows, ambushes, night raids, and scorched earth destruction of castles he could not hold. This war of attrition wore down the English. Villages were stripped of supplies, denying food to advancing armies. Roads were made treacherous, castles abandoned, their walls pulled down to keep them from enemy hands. Bruce's men, hardened by hardship, learned to fight as a people bound not by feudal duty, but by the promise of freedom. By 1314, Bruce's position had transformed. What began as survival had become mastery. He was no longer a fugitive king, but a strategist who understood how to shape the battlefield itself. His reputation grew, not just as a warrior, but as a leader whose patience and cunning gave Scotland its first real chance of enduring independence. And when Edward II of England turned his gaze north, determined to crush the rebellion once and for all, Bruce was ready, not only to resist, but to gamble everything on one decisive confrontation. As Bruce prepared his fragile kingdom, Edward II marched north with the might of an empire. By 1313, Scotland's fate narrowed to a single point: Stirling Castle, one of the kingdom's most vital strongholds. Edward Bruce, the king's brother, had laid siege to the fortress. Its garrison agreed to surrender unless relieved by midsummer of the following year. This ultimatum forced Edward II's hand. The English king could not allow such a loss without answering with force. In early 1314, he summoned one of the largest armies England had ever sent into Scotland, more than 15,000 men, including heavily armoured knights, longbowmen and infantry. Against them, Robert the Bruce could muster no more than 6,000. The disparity was staggering. Yet Bruce had no intention of meeting England's power on its own terms. Instead, he studied the ground. South of Stirling lay a stream, the Bannockburn, winding through marshland and thick woods. The terrain was narrow, wet and treacherous, deadly for charging cavalry. Here Bruce saw not weakness but opportunity. He trained his men in disciplined formations called schiltrons, bristling circles of spears dense enough to stop horses in full gallop. Against knights encased in steel, the Scots would become an unyielding wall of pikes. As Edward's vast host lumbered north, supply carts groaned under the weight of provisions, weapons, and siege gear. Villagers along the way trembled at the sight of England's banners, but Bruce had prepared for this march. Fields were stripped bare, supplies hidden or destroyed. Hungry and slowed, the English advanced deeper into hostile ground. By June, the two armies drew near Stirling. Scouts brought word the Scots were not running. They waited, calm and ready, in the very place Bruce had chosen. For the first time in years, it was not England dictating the terms of battle, it was Scotland. And as the English prepared their camp, a storm of steel and faith gathered on the horizon. As both armies settled near Stirling, tension thickened, and fate revealed itself in a single duel. On June 22, 1314, the fields near the Bannockburn grew heavy with silence. The English host spread across the countryside, a vast sea of tents, banners and armoured men. To Edward II and his nobles, the outcome seemed inevitable. They laughed and drank around their fires, certain that Bruce's smaller force could not withstand the might of English cavalry and longbowmen. Across the stream, the mood was entirely different. The Scottish camp was smaller, quieter, yet filled with resolve. Men sharpened spears, repaired armor, and murmured prayers with priests who walked among them. They were veterans of years of ambushes and marches, hardened by hardship, fighting not for pay, but for survival and freedom. At their center stood Robert the Bruce. Unlike Edward, he did not remain distant in a pavilion of luxury. He moved calmly among his men, sharing words of reassurance, reminding them that the ground was chosen carefully and the cause just. As the sun lowered that evening, an event unfolded that would echo through legend. Bruce, lightly armored and mounted on a small horse, rode forward to inspect the terrain. Suddenly, across the field, an English knight spotted him, Sir Henry de Bohun, nephew of the Earl of Hereford. Seizing the chance for glory, Bohun levelled his lance and spurred his massive warhorse forward, charging straight at the Scottish king. Witnesses froze, breath held as the two closed distance in heartbeats. At the last instant, Bruce swerved aside, rose in his stirrups, and swung his battle axe. The weapon crashed into Bohun's helmet, splitting it cleanly in two. The knight fell dead instantly. The force of the strike shattered Bruce's axe, but his army erupted in cheers. Their king had faced down an armoured English knight and won. That night, the Scots saw Bohun's death as a sign of divine favour. Among the English, whispers of unease spread, and so as torches flickered and prayers rose into the night, both armies prepared for dawn. The fields of Bannockburn were ready to run red with blood. Dawn broke on June 23rd, and with it came the first test of steel and will. The morning sun glinted off shields and lances as Robert the Bruce's men took their positions. Formed in schiltrons, tight hedges of spears that bristled outward like the spines of a giant hedgehog, they advanced from the woods into open ground. It was a declaration. The Scots would not hide nor scatter. They would face England head-on. Edward II's knights prepared the first charge. Columns of armoured horsemen lowered their lances, the thunder of hooves rumbling across the fields like approaching storm clouds. Dust rose as the tide of steel and horseflesh rushed toward the smaller Scottish host, but the Scots stood firm. The front ranks planted their spears deep into the earth. When the English cavalry struck, the clash was thunderous. Horses screamed as they impaled themselves upon the wall of pikes, their riders thrown and crushed beneath the weight of armour. The momentum faltered, broken on Scottish resolve. At the same time, another English force sought to outflank Bruce's army by crossing the Bannockburn itself. Yet the ford was narrow and the ground marshy. The Scots, knowing every inch of the terrain, met them with ferocity. Hemmed in by the stream on one side and spears on the other, English soldiers drowned in the chaos, while others fell beneath relentless blows. Broken bodies and shattered equipment drifted downstream as the river carried away England's failure. For the Scots, the victory of this first day was more than survival, it was proof. They had faced the feared English cavalry and endured. Their king's axe strike the evening before was no longer a lone miracle, it was a symbol of what could be achieved. As the sun set, the battlefield was littered with corpses, lances splintered, and horses lying where they fell. The English returned to camp frustrated and shaken, their vast numbers proving useless on the constricted, boggy terrain. The Scots withdrew in good order, their spirits lifted. Around their fires that night they spoke of destiny, for tomorrow they knew would bring the true reckoning. June 24th dawned, and with it came the final reckoning between Scotland's hope and England's might. The second day of Bannockburn began not with the clash of steel, but with prayer. Robert the Bruce ordered his men to kneel in the grass as clerics and friars moved among them, blessing the soldiers and leading hymns. From across the lines, English knights scoffed, mistaking the gesture for weakness. But the Scots were not begging for mercy. They were steeling themselves, calling on God to witness their struggle for freedom. When the prayers ended, the army rose as one. Spears bristled in the morning light, a forest of defiance. Edward II, restless after the failures of the previous day, commanded a full advance. His generals urged caution, warning that the narrow ground and marshes would again hinder their cavalry. But Edward pressed ahead, unwilling to appear hesitant before his lords. The English host surged forward in massive waves, the earth trembling under thousands of boots and hooves. This time, the Scots did not merely hold their ground, they advanced. Schiltrons pushed steadily into the enemy, a wall of spears bristling outward, forcing knights back step by step. Horses balked, throwing riders into the mud, while others were skewered or dragged down into the press. The famed English longbowmen, usually decisive in battle, could not find room to fire. Hemmed in by their own cavalry and pressed by the Scots, they were rendered useless. Panic began to spread. The field was too narrow, the formations too tight. Men were crushed together, unable to retreat or maneuver. Then came the final blow to English morale. From the nearby hills, camp followers of the Scottish army, cooks, grooms, servants, charged down waving banners and makeshift weapons. To the exhausted English, it looked like fresh reinforcements arriving for Bruce. Fear turned to flight. The retreat collapsed into chaos. Men trampled one another, horses drowned in the Bannockburn, and Edward II himself barely escaped capture, fleeing under guard toward the south. By midday, the once mighty English host had disintegrated. On that narrow field, against impossible odds, Robert the Bruce had won a victory that would echo across centuries. With the English army broken, the aftermath of Bannockburn reshaped both Scotland's fate and Edward's shame. When the dust of Bannockburn settled, the battlefield was a grim landscape of shattered lances, fallen horses, and thousands of English dead. The once mighty host that Edward II had marched into Scotland lay in ruins. For Robert the Bruce, the scale of the victory was beyond measure. Not only had he defended his crown, but he had also destroyed England's aura of invincibility. The spoils were immense. Weapons, armor, and supplies captured from the retreating enemy replenished the Scots. Even more valuable were the prisoners, nobles and knights whose ransoms would bring wealth into Scotland's coffers. Entire households of English chivalry had been wiped out or captured, a blow that resonated through England's aristocracy. Edward II's personal humiliation deepened the disaster. Forced to flee the battlefield, he rode desperately to Stirling Castle, hoping for refuge. Yet even there he found no sanctuary. The governor, Sir Philip de Mowbray, refused him entry, knowing the castle was bound to surrender to Bruce. With no choice, Edward fled south to Dunbar and eventually crossed back into England. His reputation, already fragile, was shattered. Where his father, Edward I, had been feared as the Hammer of the Scots, Edward II was now mocked as the king who fled from them. For Scotland, the victory was more than military, it was psychological. After decades of defeats, executions, and occupation, the nation had stood firm and triumphed. Robert the Bruce's authority, once questioned after his violent seizure of the throne, was now unassailable. The lords who had doubted him rallied behind his crown. Stirling Castle soon surrendered, as agreed in the truce that had sparked the battle. With its fall, England lost its last major stronghold in central Scotland. The road south lay open, and Scottish raids across the border grew bold. For the first time in years, the balance of power tilted north. Bannockburn had changed the war overnight. Scotland was no longer a rebellious province fighting for survival. It was a nation that had defeated one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms in open battle. Beyond the blood and spoils, Bannockburn's legacy would echo across centuries as myth and memory. Bannockburn's impact reached far beyond the fields, where steel clashed and men fell. For Scotland, the victory was more than a triumph of arms, it was a rebirth of spirit. A people once thought weak and divided had stood against overwhelming odds and prevailed. Robert the Bruce, once an exiled noble and excommunicated king, was now celebrated as the defender of Scotland's freedom. His name became synonymous with resilience and leadership. The psychological effect was profound. Across Europe, news of the battle spread quickly. Diplomats in France and emissaries at the papal court began to view Scotland not as a rebellious province but as a legitimate kingdom. Though it would take years to secure full recognition, Bannockburn laid the foundation for international respect. The battle also reshaped the art of war. The schiltron, a disciplined wall of spearmen, had shattered the prestige of heavy cavalry, the most feared weapon of medieval armies. No longer could knights assume dominance on the battlefield. Infantry, once dismissed as secondary, had proven capable of defeating the mounted elite. Bannockburn thus became part of a wider military transformation that would alter Europe for generations. In Scotland itself, the victory forged unity. Nobles who had wavered now rallied firmly behind Bruce. The memory of the triumph inspired future declarations of sovereignty, most famously the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, which proclaimed that Scots would fight for freedom so long as 100 men remained alive. These words carried the spirit of Bannockburn, echoing the same defiance that had filled the air on that June morning. Over centuries, Bannockburn passed into legend. Songs, poems, and stories celebrated it as the moment when Scotland proved its will to endure. Robert Burns, centuries later, would immortalize the spirit of Bruce and his men in verse, turning history into national anthem. Even the landscape itself became sacred, the burn and fields remembered as ground where freedom was carved with blood and steel. Bannockburn was no mere battle. It was proof that courage and unity could defy an empire, and a reminder that history is often written not by the powerful, but by those who refuse to bow. Bannockburn was more than a clash of armies. It was the moment Scotland defined its destiny. Against overwhelming odds, Robert the Bruce and his outnumbered force proved that determination, discipline, and knowledge of the land could overcome the mightiest foe. The battle shattered England's grip, transformed Bruce into a national hero, and inspired a people to believe in their own strength. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. Stirling fell, Scotland gained new confidence, and Edward II's humiliation weakened his crown at home. But the greatest victory was psychological. A nation long pressed into submission discovered that freedom was not a dream but a reality worth defending. For generations, Bannockburn became a touchstone, a story retold in poems, songs, and memory whenever Scotland's sovereignty was tested. Its lesson endures that courage and unity can tip the scales of history, even when the odds seem impossible. More than 7 centuries later, the fields where Bruce's spearmen stood still speak of defiance. Bannockburn was not merely a battle, it was the making of a nation,